Thanks so much for coming. I'm pleased to introduce Kasia Kennedy, who's going to talk about his book, The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. Kennedy is editor-in-chief of Premium Publishing at People Inc. and a former senior writer for Sports Illustrated. He has written several books on baseball, Jackie Robinson, Pete Rose, Joe DiMaggio. Tonight he's going to talk about a different horse. We all know about Paul Revere's ride journey because of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Tonight he's going to speak about more complex things that happened April 18th and 19th, 1775. Please welcome Kasia Kennedy.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. Jay, thank you for, Jay found me and wrangled me to come down here. I'm so glad you did, and thank you for that generous and kind introduction. It's a good crowd here, right? I sent out a horse to say, the Paul Revere talk is coming, the Paul Revere talk is coming. And I guess it worked because, good job. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my book here, and then we'll have a few questions afterwards, but it's great to be here with all of you. As Jay mentioned, I'm just putting up my previous books because I get this kind of question a lot. I was at Sports Illustrated, my book on DiMaggio, Rose, Robinson, and I also wrote a book on high school football, sort of addressing the question of, would you let your son play football in this time of concussion? So people often ask, and Kate asked me on the way over, oh, this is the departure, right? It's a different thing that you've done these baseball books and sports books. And in a sense it is, but it's also in a continuum. In some ways, my books, like the DiMaggio book, which is called 56, is about the summer of 1941. That's when DiMaggio had a 56-game hitting streak. And it was the last summer before the war. It's called The Last Innocent Summer. He was an Italian-American hero. It's a lot of social history. The book was sometimes reviewed in that way. So moving to writing about Paul Revere, I felt very familiar sort of in the kind of research I was doing. I was spending a little more time at a historical society rather than the Baseball Hall of Fame, but I was very comfortable with it. And the thing that really, there were two things that appealed to me about Revere. One is the way he met the moment of his life so successfully, right? So just to set the stage, I know people know the basic story, but as a reminder, so it's April 18th, 1775. There's no war, nothing has begun. There's a lot of tension, but no war. He sets out, the British go on the move from Boston towards Lexington and Concord. Revere goes on his ride to Warren that night. And the next morning, April 19th, dawn and then later into the day is when the battles begin at Lexington and Concord. And what happened in those 10 hours, 16 hours, depending how we want to look at it, fundamentally changed the whole path of the American Revolution. And Revere knew what time it was. He was 40 years old when he took that ride. He knew what time it was in his life. And he knew what time it was for this ridiculous enterprise. They were going to try to take on the British, the best funded, best trained, best equipped army in the world, a bunch of basically farmers and silversmiths and cobblers. And he met his moment. And when I was beginning the book, and this is something to think about, and maybe some of you will have other examples, there aren't a lot of people in history who we know fundamentally for one thing. Now, Revere actually had quite a long life. He lived to be into his 80s. As I said, he was 40 when he did this, and very successful in different businesses and career. But we know him for the ride. And I really couldn't, we know Pheidippides, who ran from Athens to Marathon. We have the marathon because of him. Rosa Parks, we all know her for one act, basically. Neil Armstrong. But there aren't a lot. There are not a lot of people who are known so defined by a single moment. And so my book is not, it's not meant to be cradle to grave, all known thought on Paul Revere. It's, everything is in service of the ride. His role that night and others' role that night. So that's where, that's the positioning of the book. Of course, I say it's not meant to be cradle to grave, but I did, of course, set up a little bit of his life and who was this person who would take the ride. This is a bell at the Old North Church in Boston. And I don't know if those of you who know it, but it's still there today. These bells are still there today. And Paul Revere, as a child, when he was about 15, had a job as a bell ringer at this very church, something called change bell ringing. And he went up there with 7 other boys, and the ringing, it's a beautiful exercise, change bell ringing, where you go sort of in order, in a pre-described order, one bell after the other, and it's this beautiful sound throughout that could be heard for miles and miles. And then, of course, this was the same church where later the lanterns would be hung on the night of his ride. So there was something very poignant about that coming back to him. And some of the same boys who he had that job with would be involved in his life in 1775. And there was also something about that act at a church, you know, in those days, as today, but especially then, when the church bell rang, it meant that something was going on. It meant that maybe there was a service, a sermon, or there was a meal being served, or somebody was getting married, or there was a funeral. And so, in other words, when you rang the bell, it meant that people should get up and act. They should do something. They should come. And that's kind of what he did later on in his life, of course, with the ride, telling people to come and engage. So that was part of the resonance that made me interested in pursuing a little bit about the church. I understand you had a speaker here a few weeks ago who talked about different taverns in the country, and here's one called the Green Dragon Tavern. And I'm mentioning this, I don't know if we have any Masons in the house, but Paul Revere was a Mason, and the Masonic chapter he belonged to, St. Andrew's, met in those years at the Green Dragon Tavern. Joseph Warren was also a member of that chapter, and this is basically where they plotted in the late 1760s and early 1770s all of the early parts of the Revolution, including the Boston Tea Party, which took place in 1773. And on the night when they took the Masonic roll that night to see who was there, nobody was there because everybody was down in the harbor taking the tea off the boats, including Paul Revere, who was among them, including Joseph Warren. So this is sort of the humble beginnings of sort of where it began. One thing that I wanted to say also is that Paul Revere, so the 4 guys who were mainly responsible for the origins of the revolution in Boston, where it began, so not talking about George Washington and all the people further south, were John Hancock, Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, John Adams. Those are kind of the big 4 at this time. There were definitely others. But all of those guys they went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin, then they went to Harvard, super well educated. Warren was a doctor. Hancock was extremely wealthy. He was the wealthiest man in the colonies, or certainly in that part. And the Adams were very, great orators and a long line already in America. Revere was not that. He was the son of an immigrant. His father had come over from France in 1715. And Revere went to a school called a writing school. It was essentially a trade school, and learned to become a silversmith, as his father was. And certainly didn't go to college, went straight to work. And the idea that he got so close to the real corridors of power is remarkable. There aren't a lot of people. There was a heavy class structure then, even though America was trying to get free of it a little bit. The class structure of England still held. And for Revere to get as close as he did to them was kind of remarkable. And part of the reason why he was able to do that was through the meetings at the Masonic Temple. He was very active. People saw how determined he was. His relationship with Joseph Warren, who was a real forward thinker and very much wanted to shake the yoke of British rule, really influenced Revere in that time. Okay, here he is. There's one portrait of Paul Revere. And when you're writing a book on Paul Revere, well, there's a portrait of him as an older man, but there's one of him from this time period in his life. And when there's one portrait of Paul Revere and you're writing a book on Paul Revere, you spend a lot of time looking at that portrait, I can assure you. And you think about it, and the first thing you realize when you look at it is that it's not Jack Black. Okay, it's not. A lot of people don't believe me, but it's not Jack Black. The other thing is this was painted by Jonathan Singleton Copley, who's the most famous portrait artist of that time. And he painted people like John Hancock and Thomas Gage, the head of the British Army. He painted wealthy people, religious leaders. It wasn't very often, it was very rare, in fact, that he would paint sort of a lowly artisan or tradesperson such as Revere. So maybe the Revere bartered to pay for this. And the other thing about it is that you see he's holding a teacup. That's a teapot. That's no accident. This picture was taken in 1768, so it's 7 years before the ride. He's in his mid-30s. And there hasn't been the Boston Tea Party yet, but the tax has been levied on the tea already, and they don't like it one bit. So he chose to be painted this way. The other thing that strikes me about it, the way you see his sort of hand resting on his chin. Now, if that's how you guys like to pose for portraits, there's no judgment here, that's fine. But I am telling you that there's no way that Paul Revere did this without winking at us. And I always look at this thinking like, he's winking at, no, is he winking? No, he is. No, he's not winking. He's having a little fun. He's saying, I'm not all that, right? I'm not this debonair man of thinking man. He's slipping the bounds of his class a little bit, and he's letting us know that. Here is an engraving by Paul Revere, which some of you may be aware of or know about. It's the Boston Massacre. This is probably the second most famous thing about Paul Revere. In 1770, there was an event on a square in Boston in which, so at this point I should say, as of 1768, the colonists were rebelling against they were squawking about and motioning against and protesting things like the Tea-on tax, the Stamp Act, which was a tax on paper, and other things that were happening that the British government was trying to levy on the Americans. And one thing I want to say is, so this is the late 1760s. In 1763 is when the French and Indian War ended. And in that war, British and American colonists and people loyal to the crown fought side by side against the French and Native Americans. So that George Washington fought alongside Thomas Gage, who by the 1770s was already the head of the British Army in America. So they weren't that far off. They weren't mortal enemies or anything. They spent most of their lives together. And England, things weren't great in London after that time. It wasn't like they were rolling in the dough. And they were feeling, we paid for that entire war. We were making no weapons here in America at all. All the weapons in the French and Indian War came from London. Basically all the resources. There's obviously farming here, and there was some resources here, but so much of it came from England. And now they wanted to levy some tax because they were like, we spent all our money, we're there, we're protecting you, we have our forces there. It wasn't such an unreasonable thing for them to ask. Still, the Americans didn't like it much. And so in the 1760s, after the Americans started sort of speaking out against these taxes, the British sent over a whole bunch of redcoats, soldiers. So that starting in 1768, They were quartering in Boston and often in people's houses. And at that time, there were about 16,000 people, or maybe by the 1770s, there were about 16,000 people in Boston, 4,000 British soldiers. That tells you how omnipresent they were. And in the massacre, there was this event on the square where a big crowd of colonists were sort of berating a small group of British soldiers, yelling at them, throwing stones, all of this. And finally, the British raised their guns and shot at them. And 5 people were killed. Crispus Attucks was the most famous person who was killed then. And this circulated. Paul Revere did not paint it. A man named Henry Pelham did, but he engraved it. And it went into all the newspapers, Boston Gazette, down to the Virginia Gazette, all around. And you can see by my description of the event and what happened, here it kind of looked like they just kind of marched in and raised their guns and started firing. That was intentional. It was spun for propaganda to try to raise some outrage against the British. Remember, it's really hard to get people to say, hey, let's go take on the British Army. So this bit of propaganda was really important for them. I mentioned that he was an engraver. He was principally a silversmith, Revere, and later he would become a bell maker, coppersmith. He did a lot of stuff. He hustled. He was even a dentist for a while. He was a self-trained dentist, which isn't the kind of dentist I would necessarily go to, but in those days you did what you could. So he was really sort of an active hustler. Okay, here we are at the night of the ride, and I want to just show this for those to give a brief sense of the geography. Can you see that? This is Gatsby's Green Light, which we borrowed for tonight. Here's Boston. There's the north end of Boston, and this is where Revere set out over the water, going to Lexington and Concord. This red line here are the British troops. And this green line is a man named William Dawes, who also was one of the riders last night, who I'll talk about in a moment. So I'm just going to move on from here, but I wanted you all just to have a sense of what it was. And from the north end to Lexington is maybe 12 to 14 miles, depending on the roads at that time, and then maybe another 5 miles, Lexington to Concord. This is the boat, the HMS Somerset, that was in the water the night of the ride. So again, it's April 18th, and they know that something's up because the British have brought in all the small boats off the harbor. It's very quiet, but what they've done is they've left a boat in the harbor at that point to guard against people leaving the town. And the guard specifically against Paul Revere leaving the town. They knew who he was. So in the 1760s, 1750 call it, if you wanted to send a letter from New York down to Philadelphia, you wrote a letter and you gave it to a post person who took it on a sulky, came down the post road, got there a week or so later and took back another letter from your brother or your friend at some point later, and you got a letter back. In the late 1760s, when the tension was growing between the colonists and the British, Samuel Adams put in a system called express riders. And these were folks when it absolutely positively had to get there overnight, okay? They were single horsemen, and Paul Revere was the best they had. He was the best express rider. And not just because he was good on the back of a horse, which he was, very good, he was also really good at giving the information, right? And they trusted him. John Adams said to somebody, Paul Revere will give you all the news. And when I say they trusted him, it wasn't just that they trusted him to tell the truth and thought others wouldn't. Of course he's going to tell the truth, and so would others. But he had to remember a lot of information. He often couldn't carry documents because if he was stopped by British forces, you wouldn't want to have anything on. So you had to remember whatever information it was you were giving. And you had to do it in a good way. You didn't want to stop and say, Jay, how's it going? How's the wife? The cow's okay? Good. What's going on with the crop? No, you want to give your information, be able to answer a few questions, and go on. And Revere was really good at that and really good as a rider. So he was dispatched after the Boston Tea Party, which he took pardon, it was Revere who was dispatched to ride down to Hartford, New York, Philadelphia, and say what had happened. And how else would they know so quickly? Say, hey, this is what we did. In 1774, at the First Continental Congress, when they wanted to get the Suffolk Resolve, which was essentially a declaration of, as close to being a declaration of war as it could be without actually being that, they sent Revere from Boston to Philadelphia again. He had a critical ride up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the winter of late 74. He did maybe, 18 rides, 20 rides or something before the night of the ride, and he would get paid for them. He'd charge for whatever it costs to rent a horse. And remember, if he's riding from Boston to Philadelphia, it's not one horse. He's going 80 miles, then he's changing out, getting a new horse, another period of miles, he's spending a night. And so. He'd come back and he'd say, here's the time I spent. Here's here's what you owe me for my time, for the horse, for staying over. And essentially John Hancock would write him a check. And that's kind of how it worked. He did go pro bono, though, on the night of the ride itself. He didn't charge at all for that one. So we get to the night of the ride, and this obviously was painted after the fact. This boat is a big British warship called the Somerset. And as I mentioned, it's in the river specifically to make sure that nobody can cross the river. This is obviously painted after the fact and done with artistic judgment. I don't think it does justice to how large that boat is. It was so big that in that part of the Charles River, it had to be warped in, meaning to get it perpendicular, they had to use these big ropes and wires to turn it. And it couldn't do a three-point turn, so to speak, in the river. That's how big of a boat it was. And so Revere, going, quote-unquote, by sea, rowed over and had to get past the boat. And you realize this was the most, it wasn't the most, but it could have ended right here. If he'd been spotted just crossing the river before he'd even got on a horse, the whole night would have been different. So he managed to get across that night. He wasn't the only rider. As I mentioned, and we're going to go there was another man named William Dawes and Samuel Prescott. I'll talk about them in a minute. When Revere went out, so he goes across to Charlestown, he crossed the river by boat, and once there he had to wait for somebody to prepare a horse. He couldn't text ahead or anything and say, I'll be there, get the horse ready, gas it up. So he had to get there, and they're like, oh my God, you made it out, thank goodness. They had to prepare it, and they prepared a horse for him, and then he started riding. And what he said was later that I alerted every house on the way to Lexington. Revere was really good at this because he knew lived in the north end of Boston all his life. He knew which houses to go to and which ones not to. Even though there was a lot of people sympathetic to the rebellion, there were also many people loyal to the crown, so you had to be careful where you went and what you said. And when he would tell somebody, he'd stop by, and Paul Revere is coming by. It's now 11 o'clock at night. You're in bed, you're watching TV, you don't want to be bothered. But he rouses you up, you come out in your nightcap and whatever, and he's like, hey, Fred, go ahead, get your gun. We're going to go take on the British. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are like, Paul, I'm good. I'm gonna hang out here. Some people, though, did go and get their fowling piece or whatever piece of gun they had. There were a few muskets left over from the French and Indian War, but we weren't making any weapons here, so it's not like there were plentiful guns and weapons. But so some people did come, and other people would get on their horse and then start riding out to towns like Lynn and Linfield, Reading, and things like that to deliver the news. So that if you would have looked above the sort of northwest suburbs of Boston in those days, on that night, you would have seen this like neural network of maybe 20 or 30 riders going out to tell people the news. And when you realize that the next morning the British arrive at Concord at dawn. Remember, they have about 1,000 men they're going out, so they're not moving nearly as quickly as a single horseman, right? They get there at about dawn, and they didn't meet with much resistance in Lexington. Then they go to Concord, they meet with some more resistance there, enough that it kind of foils their plans. And on the way back, they really meet with resistance, meaning they're coming on the way back. And if people know Minuteman Park in Boston, they're coming along what's called Battle Road. And the colonists, by now there were thousands of them, just shooting the British on the way back and claiming a lot of lives. And that's why it forever altered the course of the revolution. But there's no way that one horseman, no matter how good at his job he is, could get that many people there in that short of time. So it depended upon a group of people going out and in sort of a loosely concerted effort. There was a little militia, there were Minutemen, but sometimes they were just people who were on a horse at that time or able to get on a horse at that time who pitched in to do this. The only other person who left from Boston was William Dawes, and there's a chapter on him in my book. And I mentioned Revere went out over the river. Revere went out over a southern spit of land. There was only one way to get off of Boston by land, and that was the Boston Neck. And he got out, and also was supposed to go to Concord and to Lexington and Concord. The reason they were going to Lexington at that point was because that's where Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying. And they thought that the British wanted to go to Lexington to apprehend them. And the reason they were staying out there, they had lived in Boston, was just that things were getting too hot in Boston. There were vandals all over the place. They were damaging Hancock's house. Either Adams or Hancock could have been arrested at any moment. They moved out to Lexington a few weeks before this, and they had the provincial Congress out there. And so that's why getting to Lexington was so important for Revere and for Dawes, and why Joseph Warren, who did stay in Boston, dispatched them to do it. Concord was where the colonists had a lot of supplies, military supplies. And by that I mean gunpowder, yes, and cannon and guns, but also blankets, tents, axe handles, salted beef, salted cod, sugar, things, medical supplies, things that you would need in case of a battle. And they had them all hidden in Concord, and the British, they thought, and they were right, were going to go and try to take all of these things to try to make the colonists less able to defend themselves. So that's why Lexington and Concord. Dawes goes out his way, Revere goes out his way, and when Revere gets to Lexington, he knows that Dawes actually left earlier than him, but he still hasn't shown up. He ends up getting there about half an hour later, and for some reason, Dawes doesn't appear to have alerted anyone. And we know that because of the path he went. They did do a roll call the next day at the battles or afterwards, people sort of were documented who was in Concord and Lexington, and they didn't come from his town, or nobody said, oh, Dawes told me. People came from Revere's path, and it almost always traced back to Revere, or again, Revere is the progenitor. There were many other people who then spread the word, but he had a much more effectual ride. After they're in Lexington a little bit, they get there. Hancock and Adams, they tell them, okay, there are 800, 1,000 British forces coming your way. Hancock gets out his gun. He wants to go and start fighting. They had to talk him out of that and say, listen, you have too much money and you're too important. We can't lose you in this thing. But after they spend a little time there, they go on to Concord, and along the way, they run into Samuel Prescott. And Samuel Prescott is a young man, about 27 years old. He's a doctor, and his father had also been a local doctor. And Revere sized him up and realized he was loyal to the colonist cause, and they took him along with them to alert houses. And the reason they did this, I mentioned that everybody knew Paul Revere's name. They knew Paul Revere's name at this time. In every colony in the States, they knew his name. In London, they knew his name. In Edinburgh, because of previous rides. But almost nobody knew what he looked like, right? No TV, no pictures. Nobody saw that portrait, right? So if a strange guy shows up to your house and says, hey, again, we're going to go take on the British, they're coming, you may or may not respond. But if a doctor who you know and whose father you know in the neighborhood has probably been in your house at some point tells you, you're going to listen, or you're more likely to listen. And so that's why they recruited Samuel Prescott. And Prescott was the one who actually made it to Concord, and he was a critical piece of the whole tale. All right. John Hancock's trunk. This is another inanimate object that I spent a lot of time with in doing my book. One of the things I always wish is that I'd started the book a little earlier, because by the time I got started, Paul was dead. And most of his friends were dead. So I had to find other ways to report. I mentioned that ship, the Somerset. I went up to see the timbers of the Somerset, which are in a warehouse on Cape Cod. And I found this trunk, which is now in Worcester, Mass. But here's what's important about this trunk. Hancock, as I've said a few times, is very wealthy, and when he traveled, when he came to Lexington, he had an entourage with him, including a right-hand man who took care of his trunk, in which was all papers about their movement, aspects of the rebellion, things they were planning, people who were spies for the colonists, people who were suspected of being spies for the British, lots of information, the kind of thing that could not get into the hands of the British. It would give them a lot of information, and it would be completely treasonous. Hancock would have certainly been arrested, could have been hung. So he had the trunk with him, although he had it at Buckman's Tavern, another tavern which I think was spoken about here, right near the house where he was staying. Revere has gone on towards Concord. He actually gets stopped by a British patrol. Ahead of that big phalanx of 800 to 1,000 officers, Thomas Gage, the head of the British forces, had sent out some men to patrol the roads and try to prevent people from doing exactly what Revere and Dawes and Prescott were trying to do, which is spread the word. They get apprehended. Prescott, who knows the area so well, is able to get free, takes off across the meadow, and gets to Concord. Revere is captured, and when they realize, again, they don't know what he looks like. When they realize they have Paul Revere, they freak out. They're like, "What's your name?" He says, "Revere," and they can't believe it. It's like you've kidnapped the wrong child all of a sudden, right? Because they realize that, remember, not a bullet has been fired. There's no war going on. And suddenly they have taken into custody a pretty important person on the colonist side, and they knew that could be kind of bad news for them or raise the stakes. Eventually, Revere kind of talks his way free, he and several other men who'd been apprehended, but they steal his horse. We lose that horse, who goes on to be a turncoat and fight for the British. Revere, though, at that point, is a few miles from Lexington. He walks right back into the breach. He walks into Lexington to go and make sure that Hancock and Adams, who he's very loyal to, were on their way out of there. And they weren't. They were still lingering around the house. So he gets them together in a sulky, and they go off towards another town called Woburn, which is going to be another stop further away from the action. When they're just about there, they suddenly realized that they have forgotten Hancock's trunk. And you know the moment, I mean, and God rest Catherine O'Hara, who we recently lost, but you know the moment in Home Alone when they realized that they forgot Kevin? Like, Kevin! You can imagine Hancock having that same kind of feeling, the trunk. So Revere goes back and to get the trunk from Buckman Tavern, he and Hancock's valet, and they are bringing it down and carrying it to safety at dawn on the 19th. And that's why Revere sees the British coming, and he is on Lexington Green when the first shot is fired that morning. And part of why we began, the first reports we got of Revere's ride were just a couple days afterwards when he was deposed. He had to give a deposition on what he had done. And it was partly because they were really interested in knowing who fired the first shot. Then as now, both sides didn't want that responsibility. Remember, both sides, it feels like, we were all gunning. Both sides were like hoping against hope that this big war wouldn't have to happen. So there's a lot to be said of John Hancock's trunk, which is now in Worcester, Mass, and again, which I spent a little time with. His papers, I don't know where they are. We know this fellow, right? This long fellow. The reason why we all know Paul Revere, I mean, if somebody was a scholar or a teacher and studied American history, you would have heard of Paul Revere because he was He wasn't a major figure apart from the ride, but he was a significant figure. But there's no way I wouldn't be here today. You guys wouldn't be here today. You could be home having a nice time. Instead, you have to be here. Blame Longfellow. There'd be I got the horse right here. His name is Paul Revere, if it wasn't for Longfellow. He wrote this poem, so the ride was in 1775. Does anybody have any idea when Longfellow wrote his poem? Nice. 1860, he wrote it, and first published 1861. Yes. Excellent. First published 1861 in the Atlantic Monthly. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that day and year. And Longfellow wrote that. It's not insignificant that it's 1860-61. He wrote it as a cry for action for abolitionists. He was staunchly anti-slavery, and he was trying to inspire people by the acts of this person who'd done something in this last big confrontation. And throughout the poem, there's lots of echoes of graveyards and different things that tip off his kind of message. I remember being read this poem when I was 8 or 9, well old enough to read, but still loved being read to, and being read it out of this big volume of poems, which had no pictures. And that turned out to be really important because I can imagine it, just the way each of you have your own image. It's not like we all saw the same movie. We all have our own image of what it might have been. And that kind of stuck in my craw for many years till I came to this story. Anyway, when Longfellow writes this poem in 1860, he has already written Evangeline. He's written Song of Hiawatha. He's the best known, best paid, most influential poet in the world. So when he writes a poem like that, it's really a big deal. And it was pretty accurate. Like, people would complain, especially scholars in this area, that, it's not, he plays with the timing a little bit. He has Revere getting to Concord, which he didn't. But for the most part, it's quite an accurate rendering. And I feel like any license, and if you think that this poem and there's Robert Frost, and maybe, I don't know, maybe there were 3 woods diverging in the yellow wood that time, and Frost is like, let's just make it 2, it's better for the story. So he did a little bit of that, but we would have I got the horse right here, his name is Paul Revere. We'd have no Beastie Boys song about Paul Revere, no Noah Kahn song about Paul Revere, if it wasn't for what Longfellow did. I'm going to wind down pretty soon here, just a couple more slides. Here's I mentioned there was only one contemporary portrait, but there's a lot of sort of renderings of that night, and here he is. What I like about this one, and it's also not 100% accurate, but I love the way you see the light. It makes you think about what it had to be that night. It was a kind of a near full moon, a gibbous moon on that night, and that's important, both for the British who went out and for Revere, because there were no lights, right? So you had to have some light, some moonlight to see by, but also you didn't want to have it too bright because then they can all see you. The other thing is that he would not have been yelling like that. You're not going to be like, Yahoo! I mean, remember, half the people were trying to catch you, the other weren't. So you had to be very disciplined and pull up and say something. Do we know what he said? Does anybody know what he said? No? No, he never said the British are coming. Remember, everybody was British in that time, and he wouldn't be yelling that. I didn't mention, though, that Revere had 16 children. 16 children. So he didn't say the British are coming, but if he had 16 kids, somebody was coming, okay? So let's just keep it at that. Here we go to the Old North Church. And this is where the lanterns were hung. This is my last slide here, and then we're going to open it up for a few questions. I mentioned I tried to get as close as I could to this subject, including, this is where, as I said, it was Revere's idea that the lanterns be hung, because he wasn't sure. He was in Charlestown the week before, and he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to get out on that fateful night. So he said, this is what I'm going to do. He told them in Charlestown, I'm going to have somebody put 1 light up if they're going over that spit of land, and 2 lights if they're going across the Charles River, which is an estuary of the sea. And so while Revere did not do it, it was at his direction that it was done. You do a lot of research in this, and I'd, for instance, be in the Massachusetts Historical Society and be getting all different kinds of things. That's where I came across these contemporary drawings of Boston, which really enabled me to try to bring to life and describe the scenery and the area in that time. You're not just looking for documents by or about Paul Revere, you're looking for this beautiful set of pictures. I was also, at one point I asked for a newspaper from early 1775, and you have to put on the white cotton gloves in order to look at them. And then they bring out this paper, which it's been treated a little bit, but basically it's unchanged. And it's this big broadsheet, incredibly dense writing, no pictures, which would talk, so you're thinking, who's reading this exactly? And then there's descriptions of like red coat activity or local government plans, and then there's a big circle which says, and 4 heifers for sale over in Menominee, right? So with an actual working paper, and I'm sitting there thinking, I still get chills, I don't know, I'm just a nerd with this stuff, that this was on the streets, literally on the streets in Boston in March of 1775, and here it is 250 years later, and they have it. I felt the same way about trying to get close to the Old North Church, which looks today just as it did then. The steeple was blown over a couple of times in those years, but they've repaired it in kind. And I wanted to go up to the top. I do not like heights. I really am a person who doesn't like heights. So much so, I'll just tell you quickly, as Jay mentioned, I worked at Sports Illustrated for a long time, and I was once sent out to do a story on a rock climber in Yosemite. He was climbing El Cap, that big half rock, right? And I'm out there with him on another rock overlooking the valley, and he's kind of standing at the edge, looking over, talking to me about rock climbing, and I'm back there by the men's room, wherever that is over there. And I said, listen, Chris, I want to keep interviewing you, but I can't get that close to the edge. I'm just, I can't stand there with you. I'm too afraid. He was really, really sweet to me. He said, I had that fear quite a bit too. And it's healthy for a rock climber to have that, because that way you don't get sloppy, you take care of yourself and all that. So he said what I would do is I'd lie on my stomach and peer down over the side that way, and that made me feel a lot more comfortable. I said, that's a great idea. So I lay on my stomach, but I stayed back there where the men's room was. I didn't come one step closer, I'm telling you guys. So now it's time, a few years later, to climb the Old North Church, because I really want to do it. I get somebody at the church, agrees to take me up. You have to get a specific waiver. Anybody who goes on a tour there can walk up about 2 staircases to what's called a bell ringer's room, and that's just normal sort of normal access. I wanted to go past that. So first he had me sign a waiver, and he says, listen, if you fall and you land inside the property, we'll take care of you. If you land outside the property, you're on your own. Okay? So I've got this going. We go in past those floors, and there's sort of 2 more staircases, narrow, and now they're sort of antiquated. They're just like a rope banister, and they're uneven. You get to the bells, the first bell I show, which are still there. They've been in that house being rung, and they're still run on Sundays since 1744. And now to go up, you climb a series of ladders, okay? This is not an easy thing for me. I'm going up, he's going in front of me. He said part of the way up, don't look up, so I don't look up. He said, don't look down, so I don't look down. I just hold on. It's dark. I wanted to go at night, because that's when it was, and it's cold. It happened to be January. Not very insulated in there at all. Dim light. At a certain point, you get up, and there's these louvered windows with no pane, so the wind starts whipping through. Now you're like very close to the top. I'm almost crying. I'm thinking about, people I admire and what they overcame in their life, and I can overcome this, and so on. I finally get out into the belfry area, and then for some reason, this is the way, I guess, phobias work or whatever, I felt kind of comfortable. I was much less exposed. It's kind of a relatively tight, comfortable area. And I could look out, and listen, it's a lot different now than it was then, right? There's cars down on the street. There's lights. There's a yoga class going on at the YMCA. But nonetheless, you can still see the bend in the river where Revere crossed. You can see the narrow streets and the churchyard. And you really get a sense of how it happened. And there are these moments where it's not Paul Bunyan. This is not a legend. It's Paul Revere. He was a person who lived and had a toothache one day and went to work the next day and had children and all, right? So you just, there's this moments along the way where you realize the obvious, that this all actually happened and here it is. And the other thing, then we started to go back down. The other thing that I realized was, I mentioned how Revere gave the order, the request, the order, go put up the lanterns, 2 lanterns. This was to a guy named Robert Newman, who was the sexton of the church there, and so knew the church well. So when I went and did it, it wasn't as if you just say, hey, Bob, do me a favor, go up and put the attic light on. He had to go and do, on much more rickety ladders than I was going, do that same climb, had to go with 2 heavy lanterns on a leather thong across his neck and over his sides like that. Had to have a tinder box in his pocket to light it when he got up there, lighted successfully. Then he held it out, and it was supposed to be 2 if by sea. He first held it out together like that, and then moved them apart because the people who were looking from across the river in Charlestown. So if you just held it like that from that far away, it might have seemed like one light. And then he had to get back down quickly. He could only hold it for a short period of time because just as colonists could see it, so could the British. And he had to quickly get down, hide the lanterns, get out of town, right? And you realize, and those lanterns, we know that people saw them in Charlestown. They were also part of the people who activated the alarm. That is another thing that could have so easily gone wrong, could have not happened. It might have changed the course of everything that happened that night. So you try to get really close to the story in any way you can, and that's one of the ways I did it. Okay, I think we're getting a little close to question time. So I think you guys know how this works, but if you have a question, right, somebody raise their hand and somebody with the microphone will come. Thank you. Thank you very much. And you can ask me any question in the world that you want to ask me. There's nothing off limits. We have a couple people over here.
Did the lanterns make any difference in the sense of, did it alert people and that they understood 1 and 2, et cetera, so and so?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, yes, we know when Revere got to Charlestown, the people were there said, oh, we saw the lantern, and they knew what it meant. He'd alerted them in that town. Exactly how many people had activated, we don't know. And, I should point out that some of the details, I mentioned that Revere said, oh, I stopped at almost every house on the way to Lexington. But he didn't say I stopped at the Wilson's house or the Jones's house or the Carpenter's house. You weren't giving up names at that point, right? This was all treasonous stuff, and people didn't want their names on there. So some of the details of exactly who might have seen the lanterns and stuff, we don't know, but we know they were seen and had some kind of an impact. Anyone else? Oh, right here.
General Gage's wife. General Gage's wife. It was rumored that she was having an affair. It was rumored that she was having an affair with a revolutionary person in town. In your researching, did you see any evidence that she might have tipped off the revolutionaries?
It didn't take long to get salty in here, did it? Well, let's see. Let me say. So she was Margaret Kemble Gage was a really important figure. There's no evidence, I'm sorry to say, that she was having an affair, but Thomas Gage, as I mentioned, he was the head of the British Army, and Margaret Kemble Gage, his wife, with whom he was very much in love, was an American woman, born and raised in New Jersey, and her antecedents, her grandmothers were really important society. People had a long history here. The story you may be thinking of, or that got conflated, is this. When the war was beginning, she was very torn. And she said to Thomas Gage, her husband who's leading the British forces, I hope you won't do anything to hurt my countrymen. By that she meant the colonists, the Americans. She also compared herself to a friend. There's a character in Shakespeare's King John, and in those days everybody knew Shakespeare's King John the way we know survivor, I guess, today, I don't know, and a figure named Blanche, who was in a position where she said her uncle was on the Scottish side and her father was on the English side, or I might have that wrong, but lamenting, oh, if they win, I'm sad, and if the other wins, my heart is broken, and all that. And Margaret Campbell Gage described herself as feeling that way, said, I feel doubly yoked in my allegiances, and what should I do? The point of the story is that it was later found out that in addition to Revere and the other riders, somebody had tipped off Samuel Adams of about when the British might go, a couple of days before. We don't know who it is, but Thomas Gage said he only told one other person. And then there was an account which said a woman, doubly yoked in politics, gave Samuel Adams the information. And there were not a lot of women or men who would have that kind of access to Samuel Adams, who wasn't like walking around on the street, or would fit that description. So it may have been that she gave information about the movement of the British troops, and soon after that night, about 60 days later with the Battle of Bunker Hill, Breed's Hill, and soon after that, Margaret Campbell Gage was sent back to England. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence which said that she may have been the one to give that tip-off. Anyone else? Okay. No? Thank you guys all for coming. I really appreciate it.